Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 31st of August of 2023, the final day, the last day of summer military campaign, of summer operation. Tomorrow they're going to be autumn, and tomorrow is going to be completely different day and completely different goals and approaches that both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, are going to use. But before the fall, a few updates about the final day of summer. The Russians establish some kind of defense belt in the vicinity of Crimean Bridge, trying to avoid the risks of being attacked by the Ukrainian Navy drones or probably submarine drones or something like this. The Russians sank several ships and laid a net between them and basically tried to create a defense barrier. The only question I have watching on this photo is, if you sank few ships in front of the bridge, why haven't you made the same behind the bridge? Because as we know, the Ukrainians do have possibilities to make such a special operation and to attack the Russians behind them. So I believe that the Russians know what they're doing. And I hope that they will count on this situation, and they will include the situation in the risks management. Now we're moving to Kherson direction. When talking about the entire combat line from Kherson to Kupiansk, we see some kind of reduce of activity from both sides. But when talking about Kherson, this is probably the only region where we can see some kind of intensifying of actions. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions, and today we got very interesting geolocation from the western part of Kazachye Lagery. On this video we see how the Russians, using the TOS flamethrower system, attack the Ukrainian positions on the Russian bank of the river. So basically, according to this video, according to information we have, the Ukrainians, as a result of another landing operation, managed to move some infantry on the Russian bank of the river to establish temporary bridgehead in this area. After that, the Russians managed to discover and started bombing and attacking the Ukrainians with all types of weapons they have. Basically, with TOS flamethrower system, this is the best weapon against the Ukrainians who don't have like long-term strongholds without any armored vehicles. So as I understand, as a result of that counterattack, the Ukrainians lost the bridgehead. But anyway, we see that the Ukrainians probably made some kind of reconnaissance in combat to understand what kind of defense the Russians currently have on this bridgehead, and now the main purpose is to hunt and destroy the Russian flamethrower system to secure the bridgehead foothold and to start the operation one more time. Also, some Russian sources reported that Ukrainians continue sending more and more reconnaissance teams and commandos teams in the vicinity of Antonov Bridge in the settlement by the name of Dachi. On this video we see another Ukrainian reconnaissance squad who was moving and tried to establish their positions in the almost reduced to ruins building. The Russians, of course, controlled the entire situation, and right in the moment the Russians started bombing and shelling the settlement, and probably under the ruins of that building, then that entire team of Ukrainian soldiers were destroyed. Also, the Ukrainians during the day tried to analyze the situation on the Russian bank of the river, tried to get as much as possible information during these reconnaissance operations, as well as in the vicinity of Dachi, Antonov Bridge, and Kazachye Lagery. Of course, the Russians, to prevent and to reduce the Ukrainian possibilities, were forced to show and discover their own artillery systems, their own ammo depots. The Ukrainians tried to track this information, to collect, and after a moment, the Ukrainians also tried to attack and to destroy the Russian positions. For example, during the day we just got another destroyed ammo depot. Also, using the HIMARS system, the Ukrainians destroyed another Russian artillery position. Of course, I'm not saying that this is a very effective way to use HIMARS weapon against such a howitzer like D20 or D30, but if the Ukrainians don't have any other chances or options, maybe this is the best solution for them. Now we're moving further to the Orekhov bridgehead, to the Orekhov area, Bradley Square, and or Robotyne flower, whatever you like. When talking about today, we got just one update from the Ukrainian sources and from the Russians as well, that the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack the Russian positions in direction of Verbova. The Ukrainians were moving, and at least two Ukrainian teams managed to get the northwestern edge of the settlement. The Russians managed to discover, to counterattack, and as a result of probably artillery fire, tank fire, and so on, the Ukrainians, those two teams of Ukrainian soldiers, were destroyed. I believe that was just a regular reconnaissance in combat or reconnaissance in force. The main thing that Ukrainians wanted to achieve is to discover the Russian artillery positions, because as you know that during the previous days the Russians changed changed a lot of their positions. They have mixed everything from the beginning. They removed their FEP drone squads, they moved their artillery closer to the Azov Sea and so on, and currently the Ukrainians lost important information. Now they need to start this process from the beginning. The only important thing that I believe we need to discuss regarding this area is that Ukrainians use the most important road between Danilivka and Robotyne very much. They use this area. They're sending a lot of armored vehicles, a lot of tanks, lots of trucks, a lot of light cars to supply and support their forces, and basically to accumulate their forces, their critical mass, some among the fields, and after that from these directions to continue their offensive operation. So currently, when talking about the Ukrainians, they're doing just one thing. They try to concentrate forces as much as possible, not just infantry, and they try to move tanks, they try to move armored vehicles, they try to hide. I don't think that Ukrainians are going to spend for these purposes many days. They have just few days. Right until the Russians will complete their own regrouping. So I expect that in a day or two the Ukrainians will restart their offensive operation, and they will try to attack, and they will try to get inside the Verbovo and probably to develop their bridgehead in the vicinity of Robotyne. Also important update regarding this supply road is that Ukrainians haven't completed one of the most important goals regarding this area. As you can see, the Russians, based on the videos, geolocations, we have established full fire control over this territory, and the Ukrainians do have significant level of losses while using this supply road. If you remember, yesterday we discussed the jam and the traffic on this road. We saw a lot of cars, Bradley's tanks who were using this area to send their forces to the south. We see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians, and probably the Ukrainians have up to 30% of losses while using this road. And the main reason of that is that the Russian positions located too close to the combat line. The Russians don't have any problems to establish eye control, and of course eye control always lead to fire control, and this is the reason of heaviest losses from the Ukrainian side. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce clashes in this area during the previous day, the Ukrainians lost 85 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles and 5 artillery systems. As you can see, the level of losses is not so heavy. And now we are moving further to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. When talking about this area, we see that neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians made any actions to attack or to make any offensive operation. Both sides tried to concentrate forces and not to allow to concentrate forces to the enemy. The Russians established full fire control, full drone control over the supply roads that goes between Makarovka, Staromayorska, Robotyne. They used their FPP drones to attack the Ukrainians while they're on their move, and as a result of those attacks the Ukrainians had a lot of losses. And when talking about the Ukrainian side, this is probably another day or 5th or 4th day in a row when the Ukrainians haven't published even a single geolocation of their attacks against the Russian positions. The only video we have that we can use for the geolocation purposes is that the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian positions on the south of Robotyne, which also confirms that the Russians still have or saved some control over the edge positions of Robotyne on the south. This is probably the geolocation confirmation of Russian positions in this area. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 100 soldiers. Also, the level of losses is not so heavy in comparison with the days when the Ukrainians were attacking to the south massively. Now we are moving to the south, Donetsk direction. Today we got a lot of updates. The sources are saying that Ukrainians try also to accumulate their forces in the vicinity of Ugledar, Vadiana in this direction, and the Ukrainians are planning to use these forces to attack in direction of Volodymyrivka and Nikolskaya. During the previous days, they made few reconnaissance in combat, reconnaissance and force operations. All those attacks were repelled. During those operations, the Ukrainians managed to discover Russian fire positions, and currently they're trying to work out every single position they managed to discover, artillery position, ammo depot position, and so on. Of course, using cluster rounds, using HIMARS, using FPV drone strikes, and so on. And the same story we can talk about the Russians. They also tried to discover and to understand Ukrainian positions, and as a result of Russian artillery strikes, few buildings were damaged. For example, in this video we see how the Russians used guided bombing. As a result of that attack, probably a very important navigation post was damaged of Ukrainian forces. The post haven't been destroyed or ruined, but anyway probably was heavy damaged. Another video we got from the north, how the Russians managed to discover another Ukrainian artillery system, and as a result of artillery strike that system was destroyed. We got more updates from Krasnogorovka. The Russians haven't launched any offensive or assault operation yet, but they continue storming and bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions. As we discussed in the previous videos, there is almost complete absence from the Ukrainian side of any counter-artillery or counter-drone duels in this area. The Russians don't have any problems and barriers to discover and to attack the Ukrainian positions. And if we increase the number of updates since the beginning of August, we see the configuration, the structure of Russian focus. The settlement is under very heavy Russian fire, and we see one more time complete absence of any counter-artillery or counter-drone duels from the Ukrainian side. Of course, this situation can lead to a very critical situation for the Ukrainians in this direction. We got just a few videos of Avdiivka, so they're not very important. They're not changing the entire situation in this area. Now we're moving to the Bakhmut Artyomov front line. Today I have updated the map. As you can see, I have colored the road between Klishchiivka and Avdiivka in the gray zone, because we got certain geolocated confirmation that Ukrainians established control over this road and over the trenches during the previous days of clashes. So basically this area, or at least under Russian-Ukrainian control, or probably in the gray zone. The Russians continue bombing and shelling Klishchiivka with helicopters with Ka-52, and as you can see, have you mentioned, maybe not, that since the beginning of August, the number of videos of the usage of Ka-52 helicopters have been significantly reduced. During the first days of Ukrainian greatest counter-offensive operation that took place in June and July, almost every single day we got 4, 5, 6 videos how the Russians were destroying the Ukrainian tanks and Bradleys and strikers and so on. And today probably we have just one video per day, and there might be few explanations of that. The first one, probably the main one, is that the Russians tried also to concentrate and to accumulate the critical mass of helicopters before some operation. And the second reason is that during the previous months the Russians probably lost 2 or 3 helicopters during the battle on one of the front lines, and this is a very heavy damage, and currently the Russians probably try to understand and to realize what they can do next and how to reduce the losses among their helicopter forces, because helicopters are very expensive type of weapon. So when talking about Klishchiivka, to underline everything, no changes. Probably the Ukrainians will make more attempts to attack, but for now they need to accumulate some critical mass for these purposes. When talking about Siversk bridgehead, we see some kind of Russian artillery superiority in this area. The Russians during the day bombed and attacked a lot of Ukrainian positions, starting from Liman and ending in the settlement by the name of Sporne, where they make intelligence operations 24 hours, 7 days a week, trying to analyze and to get as much as possible updates from the ground, and as a result of that operation they get significant number of information that they need to work out every single day. So we see the results of that operations. Another interesting updates are coming from the Lysychansk oil refinery area. The Ukrainians continue from their side track and destroy the Russian positions. On this video we see how the Ukrainians discovered the Russian anti-tank artillery system, and as a result of Ukrainian artillery strike that system was destroyed. The Russians from their side were continuing bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions in the vicinity of Sporne. And the Russians reported that as a result of clashes on Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost 365 soldiers, and just pay attention to the number: 37 vehicles, including 3 Bradleys and 32 light cars. Very difficult to understand where exactly did the Ukrainians have such significant losses, but probably during another attack or another attempt to storm Bakhmut. And the most important, that Ukrainians for some reason start using light vehicles, and usually, or when talking about the battle of Bakhmut, when the Wagners were storming the settlement, the Ukrainians started at some point using light vehicles because they're very fast and they can do a very fast evacuation process. So probably the Ukrainians are using the same tactic in the vicinity of Klishchiivka. As you can see, the main Ukrainian settlement is located very far from from the combat line and to get more forces, to get more troops, and to evacuate wounded soldiers. It's better to use light vehicles, but not to use Bradleys or Strikers or other heavy types of weapon, because it's too tasty piece of cake for the Russians, and to use just light cars sometimes is not very interesting for the Russian artillery forces. Furthermore, the Russians reported that Ukrainians were trying to implement some special operation in the vicinity of Kramatorsk airport, and there were 2 helicopters Mi-8 with 6 pilots on board, and the Russians launched their own aircraft, their own air forces, some probably Su-24 or something like this, and the Ukrainians realized at some point that they were tracked and discovered by the Russians, and they tried to put their helicopters on the ground and to become invisible for the Russian air forces. But for some reasons, maybe they did some mistake, the helicopters fell down and were destroyed, and 8 pilots were killed. Now, when talking about Tarskoye salient, no changes on the ground, just regular artillery duels, and the level of losses is the same, very low, and the same as the previous day. Interesting update we got on the Kupiansk front line, another geolocated video. The Russians destroyed another pontoon bridge that connected the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Sinkovka with the main forces that are located in the vicinity of Kupiansk and in Kupiansk itself. If you remember, during the previous 2 weeks, the Russians have already destroyed the bridges that connected Kupiansk with the, let's say, Sinkovka area. That was a very powerful bridge, and just let's remind you that this is the bridge, as you can see a little bit to the south between Kupiansk left and the west and the left side of this area. The bridge was destroyed, damaged, and now the Russians have destroyed another pontoon bridge. So as you can see, the Russians try to reduce the Ukrainian possibilities in logistic, and the pressure in this area is still very heavy. But when talking about the losses of Ukrainians, just 50 soldiers per day, so we see some kind of reduce of activity from the Russian side. When talking about the Ministry of Defense, they continue to report that the Russians improved their positions along the combat line, but yet we haven't received another day without any geolocations along the combat line in this area. And another artillery system was destroyed in the vicinity of Raigorodka. On the Raigorodka bridgehead, Karamzinovka bridgehead, the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian Grad system, and as a result of Lancet strike, that system was destroyed. The Russians reported that during the previous day, the Ukrainians made at least 5 attacks and the Ukrainians were trying to restore their positions in the vicinity of Novoyegorovka and in the vicinity of Sergeyevka. This is the small settlement Sergeyevka, but all those 5 attacks were repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians were using for these purposes 68th Jaeger, 32nd and 43rd Mechanized Brigade. The Russians managed to repel those attacks and to save their control over the newly created bridgehead on the area on the Ukrainian side of Zherebets River. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.